Okay, live. Links right here.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
Fantastic. Tweet out that YouTube link. Don't tweet out the Be Dead or don't tweet out the event page. Just the YouTube link. People will be able to watch it right on there.
Okay.
Don't let your laptop run out of batteries because that's the one that's actually streaming out. So we're going to want it live for the entire event. Did you want me to go first? Because I feel like I'm probably going to go for like 90 minutes. Or
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's do that.
Okay.
So I'll do like a quick intro and give Steve is here at the end. I think we'll do this after yours and before our show.
Should I go through all three of my talks or just?
Time. How are we doing on time?
It's really up to you guys.
I think I don't know. You have experience in this stuff, so my guess is you probably start losing people after an hour or so.
Okay.
So what? However,
I mean, they're different topics, so it's not the same topic for an hour. Like I can get through each one in about 30 minutes, probably.
We have 2 hours to play with, and his talk is about 30 minutes. So it really is up to you. I'll let you play it by ear.
What
Stamina level?
What experience level do you think everyone's at? I think it's beginners.
There are going to be a few people, but I would say I recognize a third of these people as professional Ember developers.
Okay, all right. That's why I went to the EmberATX May. It's more of a beginner level talk.
Okay. All right, I am going to tweet this link out, and I guess I'll do that after. You want to hear it?
No, I'm good. Thank you. I do admire.
Oh, you probably need power though.
Yeah.
So you want you want your factory and your pictures too.
Can you handle this? Are you ready?
Just one.
So close.
It's working really quick. 3 hours. How are you? How are you? I want to use I also
Do we have any more seats anywhere?
Maybe we can ask
We have a few emergency chairs in here, the 4 kitchen chairs.
Cool.
The wedding chairs. Perfect.
Stanley is
I also. Okay.
Wow.
This is the thing that we're thinking about.
It is, actually. I just noticed that.
Okay, I guess we should probably get started. Is everybody? We're still figuring a couple of chair things out. Charles is grabbing the last extra few.
Yep. There's one more seat over by me too.
And his name wind up.
Safe travels. Happy travels.
There's one, Rick. There's one more over here. Yeah. Okay. I think we're good. I think we'll have a seat for everybody. You can probably grab
sitting
one.
back there, and then maybe.
Okay. Welcome to the Angular meetup.
Angular.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. We actually were we sold out to Google. They bought it. They actually bought the meetup. So, but thank them for the sandwiches. Hi everybody. It's Ember Night. A lot of people here are new. Yay. Welcome. Okay, so quick question. How many people here are new to Ember, like brand new? Okay, wow, almost third, half the room, almost. Okay. How many people do Ember professionally for their job? Okay. All right, so it's pretty good split, Ryan. You got your work cut out for you.
I could start with the EmberATX talk.
That might be good.
Okay.
So yeah, sorry to keep throwing curveballs at you.
No worries.
We're actually broadcasting this on. I said we were not going to stream this because I don't know how to do it, but Brian does. So we're actually streaming this live right now. So I'll tweet a link to that if you guys will get your Twitters ready and retweet when that happens. So follow EmberATX on Twitter and retweet the link. So I'm Brandon. I work here at the front side. Yay, front side. We help people with Ember stuff, and very similar to what Brian does, but probably on not the same scale. But we are glad that everybody's here. And it's Brian's going to talk about some cool stuff, and then Charles is going to blow your minds additionally if there's any of them left after Brian. So beer is out here. I think there might be a little more in the fridge. I'm not sure. Sandwiches are over here. If you didn't get one, please do. If you didn't get enough, get more. And that's it. That's all I got for you.
Cool.
Take it away.
Thank you. On this side. All right. Hello, everybody. Brian Cardarella, consultancy in Boston called Dockyard. We do primarily EmberJS development, front end, Rails, and the back end. And I got a few presentations I'm going to go over with you guys tonight. The first of which is a deep dive into EmberObject. If you are new to Ember or if you've been doing Ember for a while, you may get something from this. It's going to start out very basic and then be probably some hoping that you'll take something away from this. It's very important to understand EmberObject if you want to really have a good understanding of Ember. And let's see if I can demonstrate that through these slides. So I'm going to be going over creating with EmberObject, getting, setting, what I call the X property methods, extending, reopening, inheritance, computer properties, observers, and events. The last 3 slides will be more anecdotal than really deep dives into those things. So when you're creating a new EmberObject, it is this syntax right here. So we call ember.object.create. If you come from more of a regular JavaScript background, you may be asking why the ceremony around this. Internally, it is doing a new on the class, so it instantiates it, but there's some additional lifecycle hooks that it's actually running as well. One of which is a init. Actually, the only one for EmberObject. The only lifecycle hook for EmberObject is init. So when you instantiate your object here, it will actually run the init function automatically. So this is useful if you want to have some some code automatically kick off for whatever reason. So I'm just demonstrating that with a console log. Getting and setting. Instead of using user.name and user.name equals, you're going to use user.set and then pass in the property you want to set. User.get, pass in the property you want to retrieve. So with set, we pass in the value that we're setting it to. Something's coming. The reason why you want to use get and set is there are additional things happening beyond just setting and getting the value. So in the case of set, there are some observers being kicked off. If you have computer properties that are watching this, the Ember will notify the object that this property has actually changed, whereas you don't get that with the setter equal sign. Although in newer versions of JavaScript, you can override the setters and getters to do something a little more complex. But Ember is going for wide compliancy amongst many different versions of JavaScript. So it is preferred to use this syntax, at least for now. Oh, I have arrows everywhere in my slides. I forget where they are, so we're going to see them. I bought this thing last week before I made this trip, and it's been much easier to do this than my arrows. So getting and setting of many. If you want to retrieve many properties and the values of those properties, we're going to use the get. So in this case, I'm setting 2 different values. We're going to use the get properties, and we pass in an indeterminate length of arguments. And it's going to return a JSON object of key values. Getting with default, this may be a pattern that you've used before. If we retrieve a property that does not have a value, then we want to guard against it because we don't want undefined. We may want a default value. So here you're going to use the OR symbol, and this will just say user get name, and if name is a falsy value, then it's going to default to Brian. However, EmberObject has this get with default method, and it will actually kind of do this right here, but it's a little smarter about it. You may not, like in JavaScript, 0 is a falsy value, and you may not want to guard against 0. Mass assignment. In this case, we want to set many properties at once, rather than doing individual set methods. So we pass in a JSON object of key values that we're going to be setting to. Oops. One, I guess, deficiency of this is that events do not coalesce for set properties. So if you are setting multiple properties and you have events that are, let's say you have an event that's subscribed to both name and age, it's the same event. That event, I believe, actually kicks off twice. I think I look at that as a deficiency. I don't know if our team looks at that as a deficiency. So paths. Here we have this nested object. So we have a profile key and we're passing an object into that. If we want to retrieve the title value, then we do a path like this. So in Ember, we have the concept of property paths, and this is how Ember will go and find the value for a relationship eventually. So think of it as it's doing user.profile.title, at least a little bit internally. What's really happening is that it will segment on the period, and it will split these up into different sections, then it will iterate over that array, and it will try to get the first one, and if it can get that, then it will try to get the second one off of, return off the first value, and it will continue on until it comes back with an undefined, in which case it will just return undefined. So if you had a, if you tried to get user.profile.title, if you just did user.profile.title and profile wasn't defined, JavaScript throws an error. But here, with the paths, we're protected against that. This just demonstrates how that breaks down. So it's segmented by the period. In this case, we're trying to set on a property path where I guess the first part of the path, the first segment of the path does not exist. And if we try to do that, we get this error here, fail cannot find the profile in the object path. We can guard against that by setting a default value for profile. So here we're just setting profile to an empty object. My arrows. If you have a property whose value is not yet defined, Ember will actually delegate to a function called unknown property. And by default, unknown property doesn't do anything. So we can override that to give it some special functionality. Here we are getting the name property, which doesn't have a value, so it just returns undefined. However, what we can do is that if we now have getName, and inside our class we have defined our own unknown property function, Ember will first see that name is undefined, and then we'll pass in the path into the key name, and we can use that for any way that we want. So here all I'm doing is logging out the console, and we can see that it does not find name, and down here I'm setting name to a value, and so when we get it next time, it does not actually go up to unknown property, and we get the value back as we expect. Setting unknown properties works very similar. So you can expect that when we set the property on person, if it does not previously exist, we won't actually set a value for that. But there could be circumstances where we don't necessarily want to do that. A good example of it is the object proxy class. And object proxy will actually defer setting onto the content property. So if you're not familiar with object proxy, it's what is being used for object controller internally. So if you've wondered why inside your templates, you can just refer to properties off of your set properties off of your content or your model, whichever whatever syntax you prefer. The reason is because of object proxy. And object proxy works because of get unknown property and set unknown property. So in this case, we try to set name, which does not have a value. It goes up to set unknown property, and then we can use that for any way that we want. In which case, here I'm just logging out the console. However, there may be cases where we want to have set unknown property be the default, but we don't want to apply to all of our attributes or all of our properties. So you're going to have to guard against that by putting in a default value for a given property. So in this case, we try to set name. It's already defaulted to an empty string, or you put undefined or null up there, and set unknown property is not called. This could be a pattern that you've used quite a bit. You have a admin console, and you want to toggle whether or not someone else is an admin. So you just have a little logic here. If someone is currently an admin, we set their admin rights to false, and if they are not an admin, then we set the true. We can wrap this up with the toggle property function. So here we're getting the isAdmin property, comes back with undefined, which is a falsy value in JavaScript. Toggle property will actually toggle it to true. I don't know why those are clicking on and off like that. And then when we toggle again, it'll set it to false. So toggle property will take any falsy value and set the property to true, and any truthy value and set it to false. Increment property, this could be something you've done as well. So here we have a counter, and we want to just increment our counter by 1. However, if our counter is not yet defined, and we try to add 1 to it, we get not a number. So you probably do the guard, as we had down there. You could have also done get with default. Instead, you can use increment property. So increment property will just take the current value and increment it by 1. If it's undefined, it'll assume that that is 0. If we pass in an argument to it, it will increment by that amount. So here we have an original value of 4. We increment by 10. We end up with 14. Decrement property is the opposite. So we have an original value of 4. Decrement by 10. We end up with -6. And if you do not pass in an argument to it, you end up with decrementing by 1. Now we're going to get into a little bit more advanced topics as far as inheritance goes for Ember objects. So you've probably seen a little bit of the code here on some of my previous slides. We are creating our own class with the extend method. So when we extend into a new class or a new variable, this means that we are essentially copying the traits of the parent class into the new child class. Traits can include values, but they can also include functions. So here we have a say function that we are defining during the point of extension, and then we can call that on the instance. So the functions and the values that you define within the extend function, within the extend are going to be on the instance of the class. Likewise, we can also continue to extend off of any number of classes, and those traits will continue to be inherited. Here we have a person class originally, and we extend the person class into a player class. And off of the player instance, we call say, but the say function was actually defined in the person class. We can call that say function because it inherited that trait. Just default values. So, like I said, we can define a default value in there, and that's accessible by any of the child classes. Likewise, we can define default values at the point of instantiation. In this case, we are calling person.create. We can pass in a object of key values, and these will now be values that are specific to the instance instead of global values that are specific to the class. If we have common behavior, common traits that we find ourselves building in several of our Ember objects, then what we can do is we can extract these out into a mixin, and we can share this behavior in a clean way. So in order to define a mixin, we use ember.mixinCreate, and we just, at the point of extension, we just pass in the mixin instance. And then the mixin will, the class that we're mixing into will inherit the traits from the mixin. Likewise, we can do a mixin, and we can also do the object that we showed earlier. So here we have the name mixin and then comma, and the object that will have values. It's last one wins. So if we have two similarly named properties or two similarly named functions in a mixin in the object, then whichever one was defined second is going to be the one that's preferred by the Ember object. So in this case, we see that we're getting name. It comes back with Stephanie because Stephanie was the last one defined.
So on that extend, you can give an arbitrary number of mixins and, and property sets.
Yes.
Okay.
Instead of mixing in an object, you can do two mixins. And the race conditions work just as in the same manner as the object itself. So what you may already know or are able to glean. What is the difference between an object and a mixin? Mixins are a little bit more robust than objects. There are some hooks that are part of mixins that you don't necessarily get part of the object. In many cases, you may not necessarily need it, but generally, it is if you're going to be creating mixins, then you should be using the mixin class to do that rather than just creating a raw JavaScript object, a POJO, plain old JavaScript object. So whereas we've seen creating instances, functions specific to the instance, we can also reopen the class and create new functions specific to that class. So the toString function right here is not an Ember function. It's actually part of JavaScript. But Ember uses it quite a bit internally for displaying the class name. If you're using a framework like Ember CLI or using regular Ember itself, Ember data, then Ember is able to derive the class name based upon some tricky stuff that's either doing through the resolver or through the constant. But JavaScript has no way to reflect upon the class that a given value has been assigned to, or really a value, because JavaScript doesn't really have classes either. So there's no way for Ember Object to say, I'm assigned to the person variable, so I must be a person class. So here, if we create our own Ember Object that is not part of some conventions internally in Ember, then we will have this unknown mixin value being returned from toString. If we create an instance of person, and then we call toString on the person, it will give us the parent's mixin name, the parent's class name, and then this right here is an Ember GUID. So Ember makes use of the global unique identifiers throughout all of its objects. And so this is no good. So what we can do if we want to get a little bit more information later on in our application, we can reopen our person class with the reopen class function and redefine the toString function. So we just return person right there, and now down here when we call toString on person, it returns person as we expect, and then toString on the person instance will properly call the parent class's toString, so we get that nice little thing right there. Oh, you know, I was supposed to fix these. I think I got 2 slides that are out of order, so we're going to skip 2 slides. If you've done any Ruby development or Smalltalk, and I think Python has Super as well, this will seem very familiar. So let's say we have a class that inherits from another class, and I override a function name, but I want to retrieve the original behavior of the function I overrode. One way you may tackle that is actually copying the function name. That's not very good. So inside Ember, you can use this._super, and this will actually call back up the inheritance chain to the function that is part of the parent. So in this case, I'm calling player say. It calls the say function on the player instance, and we call super, and then that actually calls the say function on the person instance because we inherited, we extended person into player. So having something like this opens up some really powerful patterns that you can build out in your applications for creating very, very clean code. Likewise, we can use super between mixins. So same deal, we have say here. Instead of a class, we do not extend into a class. We define say within the mixin. But because the say function was defined within our POJO right here, this is the one that gets called first. Well, we can call super, and we'll call up to the mixin's version of say. So computer properties, or CPs, as you may have heard them called if you're hanging on IRC. With computer properties, basically when we get anything here, it expects to get a property. But when we define a function like this, it's not seen as a property yet. So in order to do that, we want to actually define it as a property. And by default, Ember allows you to actually it mutates some of the like the function class. So functions are just classes, and functions are objects. If you're not familiar with that in JavaScript, so this, even though it looks screwy, is completely legal JavaScript. We have, however, moved away from this syntax at Dockyard. I think most examples you see out there are using this syntax right here because it seems pretty simple, but we're using ember.computed now instead. I'm kind of indifferent, but some of my devs are very adamant about it. So when computed properties are called, it'll actually cache the value. So if we do not change any of the dependent properties of the computed property, then it will not recompute the function. Meaning that if we have an expensive function, we don't want to run it again if there's no reason not to. So inside the computed property arguments, we can pass in property paths that should be observed by the computed property. And if we change the values of any of these properties, the computer property will say, okay, this value cache is now busted or it's old. We should rerun the function the next time we want to access the value. To demonstrate that, I put a console log inside the function. We get the full name off the person, and we see that it logs out running the first time that I get it. The second time I get it, it doesn't log out running because the value has already been computed. I didn't change any of the dependent properties, and so it's just going to return back the value that was previously returned. It's a cached value. However, if I change one of the dependent properties values, the next time I get the property, it's going to run the entire function again. Observers are the opposite of computer properties. Whereas computer properties are you have to opt in to retrieve, observers will happen automatically. We can declare any number of arguments here that we want to observe, and whereas with computer properties, I had to get the value in order to kick off the function, and it didn't kick off when I set. With observers, when I set a function that's observing, when I internally is using a function called notify property change, when that kicks off, the observer is automatically kicked off. I believe it's automatic. It's not actually part of the run loop even. So it's a blocking event, maybe. Actually, I don't know if it's blocking, but it's not part of the run loop. It gets kicked off automatically. So we do person.setName, and we can see that the console log name of set is done. And every single time I call person.setName, it's going to run the observed function, or the function for the observer. And you can observe multiple properties as well. So here we are setting first name, and it kicks off the function. And the second one, we're setting last name, and it kicks off the function. In one of my first slides, I showed you the init function. That's actually the only lifecycle hook for EmberATX. We have stopped overriding init just because it ends up being messy at times. There's enough classes around Ember that are also making use of init. If we forgot to call super in order to call the original init, it just ends up being bad. So instead, what we do is that we subscribe to the init event. So after init kicks off, it will trigger an init event, and any functions that are subscribed to it will also kick off. So instead of overriding init, we may have a did init function, and when we create the person, it's going to kick off this function right there. So I think the real argument for learning and really getting a good handle on Ember Object is just how deep into Ember Object actually is, and how many things inherited from it. So this number is actually wrong. It's 59 classes in total now in the current version of Ember are descendants of Ember Object. 24 direct descendants, 34 indirect descendants, and 23 Ember data descendants. To visualize that, I created a little visualization of it. So, oh, this is not going to go full screen. This. So this is a graph that's actually generated on the fly from Ember itself, and it's using D3 to build this out. So these are all the classes and the class hierarchy within Ember. So we can see how all these different classes are being pulled back are deriving from Ember object in some way. If we add private classes, we get a few more. And if we add Ember data, we get a lot more. So if you are looking to learn Ember, or if you've been doing Ember for a little bit and you haven't really dived into Ember object too much, you should really probably stop and get a good handle on this class before moving forward. All right, that's it for Ember object. Any questions on Ember object stuff before we move forward? Yes?
So you mentioned you could call this underscore super to record method call to super or mixin in between.
Yes.
If the mixin doesn't respond to that, then it'll
I think it
pass
skips.
on.
It just keeps going up until it finds.
And then the other question is, if it doesn't find one, like in your init example, say you forget to call super or init or whatever the method is. If you call super, just in case there's something in your
If there is no super method and you call super, are you asking if it blows up?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe.
It's a common pattern in like an OO language.
To always make sure.
Always call
Yeah.
super and never override like an if and not call super.
Yeah, you run into that with your mixin example.
What's that?
You like try to call super, and there's not a mixin or something.
Maybe I had that.
You'll end up in a,
We can try it real quick if you give me a second. We can just do EmberJS stuff. Try a new one here. So we will do. We'll do. And I'll do. So let's. Yep. Oh, I need to make this. So I don't think it blew up. Just find out. Nope, doesn't blow up.
Okay. I have one other question.
Yep.
Your on init function, or called did init,
Yeah.
is that going to end up intercepting calls to did init from any ancestor? So if you have that pattern across your company, it's that we have like this class that did init.
Yep.
You also.
Oh, I see. So if there's multiple data nits and they're subscribed to the on init,
Yeah.
I think it doesn't matter what the function name is called. I think as long as it subscribes to it, because those functions exist on the prototype, and so they're there. I can't say for certain. I think it should still kick off. Okay.
If you put in a init on mixin, if you have like an init on mixin, you mix it into an object, both will get fired, but the mixin happens. I'm not clear on the order, but they both fire. If you like override init, without calling super. So like, if you say, if you like create a mixin and then you create a class, and the mixin does, and then you mix it into the next class, both units happen. I'm just unclear on the order.
Are you talking about
If it's
init event or the actual init method?
the init, like overriding the init key.
Okay.
Both will get fired if it's a mixin. I don't know if you had like the person player, if you were saying that player was a person and player re-implemented init and you didn't call super, I don't think both of them get called. Does that make sense? So like, if it's a mixin, it's treated a little bit differently.
Well, and because it doesn't crash, it sounds like it's a good practice.
Yeah.
To just always just.
But it's actually, because of that weirdness, they have a function extension called on. It's a better thing to do. That way the super thing's out of the picture. So you'll just do like did init.on init, and then you don't have to worry about the super call. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think his first question was if multiple subclasses have the did init, and they all have the same name of didn't, they all get called.
So I don't think the name of the function matters because it's just an object at that point.
Right.
It's just responding to the event.
Actually,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's interesting. That's a good one.
It's part of the event, I think you have a
Yes.
make change that will.
Yeah.
So is one of the things that got me thinking is with mix-ins, you can obviously extend like instances. Are there hooks like that are part of the public API to extend the classes that they're mixed into? Kind of an analogy would be in Ruby, like with
Extend
modules.
ourselves.
You can with modules you have the included or
Yeah.
inherited hooks that you can actually not just not to add methods to the class, but you get some code that will run, so you can you can add a bunch of you can do some meta programming on the class.
So I know the mixins do have lifecycle hooks that get kicked off. That's why you want to use them rather than just the POJOs. I think that what you're referring to is part of that.
Okay.
I don't recall the lifecycle hook names off the top of my head though. Yes.
And then just a quick detail, if you set up an observer on a computer property, it gets fired every time any dependency of the computer property.
Well, the computer property is observing those dependent keys. So the computer property inside the property function you pass in the other properties you want to compute against. And when any of those properties change, all it does is it invalidates the cache on the computer property. So the next time you get that computer property, it will run it.
Right, I understand, but you can set up an observer on any property. Right?
Yes.
So if you set it up on a computed property,
Oh,
does
I
that
see,
mean
I
that the
see.
observer gets fired anytime any dependency of the computed property gets modified?
Only if the
Only when
computer
you
property
get it.
changes.
Yeah. So the computer property would have to change.
Someone would have to get the computer property.
Yeah, somebody
Okay,
has
that's
to-
Well,
the-
but even if the dependent keys change and you compute and the value was 1 and you recompute and it's still 1,
Yeah.
it won't fire any observers.
I get that, but someone will have to observe, somebody will have to query the computed property
Yes.
in order
Yeah.
for the observer to get fired.
Yes.
Okay. It's like quantum mechanics.
I mean, most of the cases you have these properties
You
bound.
have to measure it.
In most cases, you have these properties bound within your template. So you are observing them, like you're just getting them automatically when they change. So you're going to have that that change bubble up automatically.
So, if you, just one quick thing about, because like Charles brought this up, with mix-ins, you're saying like they inherited hook. Now that I think back, when you create an object and it has mix-ins, it creates the object first, and then it hits the inits of the module, the mix-ins. So like, if you were to set up like some kind of properties on your class, like events that you want to listen to, the mixin will have access to those properties so that you could actually modify the behavior like post-creation, does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm more thinking like
You want something similar to like included.
yeah, I want something like in Ruby, something like it included.
Oh,
So a hook, so you can both add methods, instance methods, and
Oh, at the
class
time
methods
of
in one
extend.
place. What's that?
You're talking about like at the time of extend.
At the time of extend,
Yeah.
actually going in and doing some introspection on the class that's being extended.
That's interesting.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. Ember validation is Ember Easy Form. These are two libraries that I wrote when I was actually learning Ember. I had validation rules in JavaScript already built. I built out a gem for Rails called
Keep the AC on.
okay, called client-side validations. What that would do, it would actually extract your server-side rules out of Rails and apply them to your form. But as the needs for that became more complex, the ability to manage that without having any like, conventional model handling it really made it very difficult to do. So when I was learning Ember, I figured that there were no validations in Ember. I would build something. After, I think 2 months after I built this, I figured out I found out someone else had previously built another library called EmberValidations before mine, so I feel bad for stealing the name of it, but it's already done, so can't go back. Oh, here's me again. All right, so these two libraries are very complementary towards one another. They love each other. EmberValidations is only concerned about the model layer. People that ask me questions are about it are very curious why the state of the validations are automatically kicked off whenever you're changing property values. The answer is because EmberValidations does not care how you present the errors. All it cares about is notifying you the current state of the model's validity. Whereas EmberEasyForm is, if you've done Rails, you maybe heard of another library called SimpleForm. I ripped off that and built out EasyForm because I like SimpleForm. I wanted something similar to build out semantic forms very quickly in Ember. And this was back before the input helper existed in Ember. This is when you had to do view, Ember text field, and all that stuff. So anyway, EmberEasyForm will actually help with the presentation of the errors, amongst other things. So there's two rules that I believe in when I was building out EmberValidations. And the first one is pretty obvious, even though I've seen plenty of people actually violate it, that your server-side validations are the only things that you should be using to guarantee your data integrity. If you are guarding against form submission in the client and you have no validations on the server, you are going to get fucked really bad someday. It's going to happen, especially with Ember, because you're building on an API, it's a nice RESTful API, and someone's going to poke around, and then they're going to discover that, oh, this API will take anything. So you should always have server-side validations. Always, always, always. Client-side validations are the only purpose of client-side validations are to guide your user in providing you a particular type of data. They should not be used in any other form. So if you're interested in the project, it lives here on GitHub under the Dockyard account. We actually build all green builds onto builds.dockyard.com. So if you're using something like Bower, which I hate Bower, I want it to die, but because the #1 issue that gets opened up on EmberValidations and EmberEasyForm is, can you include a dist directory inside your GitHub repo? And my answer is no, close, because I don't believe in actually compiling my assets and checking the source control, which Bower insists that we do, but it's bad. Anyway, that being said, there is a problem with the latest build on Travis CI for whatever reason. It's passing locally, so if you want to use it, if you go to my gist on GitHub, you'll be on the page right there, but if you don't feel like memorizing this number, just grab that raw gist, and that is the proper build of it if you don't feel like putting together a Ruby build system on your computer.
Be able to see the slides later.
Yeah, they're sure.
Posted somewhere.
Yep. So here is the extent of how to implement validations inside your models or controllers. So you want to start by mixing in the validation mix-in. This will add in all the validation traits into the proper class. And then you have this validations hash. So the validations hash is made up of properties. These are properties that should be accessible. And then the property hash itself is made up of validation rules. So in this case, we just see presence true. So this will actually require you to provide some sort of value for the name property. Here's a more complex one. In this case, on presence true, I've replaced it with actually changing the message. So the default message, I forget what it is off the top of my head, but I think it says you must provide a value. Here I've changed the message to you must provide a name. So this is the message for the error that will be returned. Length is another validator value, another type of validator. So here's an option that we're passing in. We are saying that this must be of length minimum 5. And then age has a numericality validator here. So I am asking that users provide an actual number for the value. So if these type of validations look familiar, it's because I just ripped them right out of Rails. Again, like I said, I built up the client-side validations gem, so I had the rules already. I had the tests for the rules, which is even more important. But I refer to these as common validations. So it includes absence, acceptance, confirmation, exclusion, format, inclusion, length, numericality, and presence. No uniqueness yet. This isn't just there's a problem with the way I originally wrote Ember validations and the way I see a lot of other Ember validation libraries written, and the way I see a lot of JavaScript validation libraries written in general, is that they are blocking. They're not asynchronous in any way. And that's fine in the Rails world, or in the server-side validation world, because your user only cares about what ultimately comes back from the server. So you can send off the request to the server can kick off the validations whenever it feels like, as long as those validations are run before the response comes back. Whereas in Ember world, we want immediate notification if some of our data is not correct. Some of you just getting going, maybe building out form-based applications, but eventually you'll realize the power of Ember, and you can build out very complex desktop quality applications with Ember. So if we change a dial on something, we want immediate notification that this has an impact upon our application in some way, perhaps through an error notification. And we can accomplish this through validations. So Ember validations is all async, and it will always represent the current validity of your given model or a given controller. This is going to be, I'm kind of using bastardized CoffeeScript just because it's shorter, and some of this code ended up being really long with all the brackets. So this is a breakdown of what validator classes look like. In fact, when you define a validation role, it will instantiate a class. And so you're working off of individual instances of validators rather than doing a one-off rule. So when you, there is a validate function internally that will iterate through all the iterators and run them, but the validators themselves are actually observing the properties that you've associated them with. So when those properties change, the associated validators will also run. But here, the base validator class, we have this init function, and this creates an errors array on the validator instance. So each validator actually has its own array of errors. There could be instances where you have more than one error message that's been generated by this validator. We have dependent validation keys, so we may be wanting to observe more than one type of property for a given validation. Example of that is confirmation. If we have a password field and a password confirmation field, we want that validator to run when we modify either field, not just the password field, not just the password confirmation field. The call function is what's actually going to be used by the individual validation instances or classes, so it's not implemented by default. And then this isValid flag is on the instance of a validator. It is going to be true when the errors array is empty. So this is a computed, Ember computed here. And .empty will we pass in the path to the array, and when it's empty, isValid will be true, and if it's not empty, we have an error message, isValid is false. Oh, I have highlights. This is a little simplified version of the presence validator. So the presence validator inherits from the base validator, and the init function we call super, like we saw in the Ember object talks. But I could have subscribed something to init, but that kicks off afterwards. I needed super to run before this init function did, so I call init first, and then I do my thing down here. So Ember Validations has a very light internationalization implementation. It will prefer James Rosen's Ember i8 interlibrary if that is available, but it will render messages or get messages from its own message service internally. If you've messed around with Rails validations, again, I come from a Rails background, so a lot of my implementation was influenced by the way Rails created validations. So the key for the presence validator is blank. And then inside the call function, if the validation fails, in this case it is not empty, or it is empty, we push the error message onto the errors array for this given validator instance. So what ends up happening, and the reason why we have a isValid flag for every single validator instance, is because I started to realize that we come up with a concept of what I'm calling the validation graph for validations inside Ember. So the validation graph is possible because on the class that you're validating against, the object that you're validating, there's a validators array on that instance that gets created. Every validator instance that is coming out of our rules gets pushed onto the validators array. And then the isValid flag for the object that we're validating is actually it's observing all of the validators in our validators array for isValid flags there. So if any of them are false, our object's valid state is false. If they're all true, then our object's valid state is true. So did it skip ahead? I think I have slides out of order. This is the relationship one. So what we have here is just imagine that this is assigned to a person class, and this is an owner class, and this is a dog class. So this dog class has its own set of validations, right? So when we instantiate this object, the dog object itself will have isValid flag. Up here on the owner's validation rules, if we don't pass in an object for this property, we pass in true, it will take the object that is at that property path and push that onto the validators array. So the validators array does not necessarily have to always take validation instances. It will take any object that has an isValid flag. So when we realize this, that we can actually pass in other objects that are being validated, we end up being able to build out a very deep what I call a validation graph. So each of these blue circles can represent a given Ember object, and then these lines will represent the relationship between the objects. So on the parent object, we'll have like two relationships here, and this one has one all the way down here. So when the one all the way at the bottom, if there is a validation rule within that object that becomes false, that isValid state bubbles all the way back up to the graph, all the way to the top. So if you're building out if you have ever tried to build out very complex relationships and are concerned about the validation state amongst all these relationships, Ember Validations makes it very, very simple for you to do this. Does this concept make sense with everybody? Does this jive? Okay, cool. So the library itself, there is no uniqueness yet. There is a pending pull request by one of my devs to implement it. I've held off on it. Get to that in a second. Handling server-side errors. So this is probably the second most common question I get asked after the Bower installation stuff. So the original version of this library handled server-side validation errors, but the Ember errors object that was previously on Ember data, it would just blow it away. So when you mixed in validations into an Ember data object or Ember data class, when the errors came back from the server, it would take the errors object that Ember validation defined, delete it, and then create a new POJO on that property, and Ember validations would fail. There was a, what I think is very misguided errors implementation that was pulled into Ember very, very quick a couple of months ago. And so I tell people not to mix their validations into Ember data objects. I think that you should be mixing them into the controllers in most cases. The reason for that is your controllers are the context in which you're dealing with your data. So if you build out validation rules for a given model and put them into the model, these now become global validation rules that are throughout your entire application. What if you have a form where you are just modifying the password for a user object? The isValid state on that object is going to be false because you're not going to have all of the given inputs that are validated against in your global validation rules that are defined in your model. So for the password change routes, you may want to have just, here's my validation rules just for this given form. There is, when I built it originally, I used the old Ember build system, which was Ruby-based. Thanks to Robert Jackson, it's been moved over to ES6 module. Ember has been moved over to ES6 modules, and very soon to be broccoliified, I guess. I want to do the same thing with Ember validations. We're going to do it eventually. So the number one uniqueness is going to, and number two, coming up with a good solution for this, is going to be held off until we come up with, we get this refactoring done. I just want to go back to number two for a second. The other problem with handling server-side validations is what if you're not able to map back the server-side property to a client-side property? What if it's a 500 that's coming back? So how do you guide your users to resolving those errors in those cases? So I think that the first pass to handling server-side errors is to not allow users to, not allow them to be pulled into Ember validations at all and just use them for presentation purposes. If there are error messages being returned from the server, these error messages should be useful to the user in some way, saying like Stripe authentication failed or something like that. And then the user may be guided on doing another form submission, but we can't clear these error messages out in the same way that we do for Ember validations because there's no way to resolve them on the client because we don't have the context available on the client. Or if there's a 500, you want to be able to show like a server unavailable at this time. So we've talked a little bit about having a base property that will just delegate out to if you're mixing into your controller, the content object, if there's an errors object on there, just reading off those errors. But still don't have a fantastic solution for this just yet. All right, so before we move on to EasyForm, any questions on Ember validations? Answered everyone's possible question. That's awesome. Okay, yes?
You mentioned a set of like easy validations. Is there a set of
Common validations?
like you were like presence is one of them. Like, is there a set of non like
So
functions?
No, but one feature I'm going to be adding is ability for custom. Well, you can do custom validations right now. You just create your own class and inherit it from the base class. But that is not always best, or at least you're jumping through a few hoops. Like you might want to do something very, very quick inside the validation rules itself. So we've talked about creating something similar to doing computer properties off the function. So you're going to create a function that gets passed in like 2 arguments maybe, the value and then the property. And if you do like .validatable off of the function definition of that, that now becomes a validatable object that gets mixed into the validations array. I'd say the common, like refer to common is just what comes with Ember validations as opposed to anything that you're going to build outside of that. All right, so Ember EasyForm. As I mentioned, API is heavily influenced by SimpleForm for Rails. So the validation resolution on EasyForm was really guided by Luke Wroblewski's research on live validations. Luke Wroblewski, or Luke W, as some people call him, he was the head UX developer at Yahoo before Yahoo sucked a while back. So he's been around for quite a while and very knowledgeable on these sort of things. Anyway, there's a list of part article that's really excellent if you're interested in it. He breaks down the different ways in which people may want to display error messages, and off of a decent amount of research, it shows what is the most optimal way for form conversion. So the most optimal form of displaying error messages are called the after display or after entry. So you type in your text field, and when you tab out is when it displays the error message. Whereas Ember Validations is actually doing live validations internally. Ember EasyForm controls the way in which these error messages are being displayed. So there's no concern, at least with Ember EasyForm, about having this constantly updated error message on the right-hand side of your form. And then after you tab back into it and you correct it, it'll disappear immediately. And then when you tab back out, it resets. Handles the user experience for Ember validations. So here's the simplest form that you can create. You're going to use the form for block and then pass in the context that you want to create a form for. And then the input helper here, I created the input helper first, and then Ember Core stole it from me and created their own. So I just override it, and you can't have theirs back. Unfortunately, there's we've been talking about for a while for how we can scope this helper to within this block. There's been many types of solutions kicked around, but nothing really viable yet. Submit is a helper for EasyForm, and then we just close the block. So it will give us this opinion on semantic markup for a given form. So why do you need a form element for a single page application? The reason for that is because of the submit button. This form element itself is linked back to a view. So when we click submit, it actually has a submit event handler, and then it will allow you to decide whether or not the form actually is submitted or not submitted, but what you want to do with the submit itself. So you may take the model and save it to the server or redirect or whatever you want to do. Not redirect, transition. The input element here defaults to the text type. The label, if you've done labels inside Ember, you may have been frustrated with not being able to get the for it properly because Ember generates its own IDs. So Ember EasyForm will properly get the GUID for that given property and give you the proper for attribute for it. So if you click on the label, it will focus on the input. The common workaround for that is labels are just block elements and they would wrap the input inside the label, but you may have a design that does not make that easily doable or may make it impossible. So Ember EasyForm gets around this. And finally, by default, a error span will be rendered out and the error messages will be populated inside this span. You can have an optional hint inside each input. And when you do that, you get a hint span. You can put some contextual stuff in there. You can also do a placeholder up here, and then we'll put a placeholder inside the input properly. You can change the type of input. So this gets a little confusing because I use the conventions from simple form, but actually this should be not string, that should be text. What we have is the default for EasyForm is that it will give you a input of type string, input of type text, but this will be expected to be a string. And when you do a input as text, it'll give you text area. So I realize that there's also text here, but again, I took the conventions from EasyForm. We're still not 1.0 on this. Sorry, I took the convention from simple form. We're not 1.0 on this yet, so I'm open to debate on changing that to making this as text area instead of as text. So it gives you a text area. These are all the types that you can do and ask for. So string is the default, or you can just do string if you like. Checkbox, select, password, email, URL, or URL, however you want to pronounce it. Tell, color, search, number, and date. There is no range in there because I didn't do it. So if anybody wants to do it, please make a pull request. The type of input will actually be, or can be derived from the property name that you're passing in. So in this case, we are doing an input on a property name password, and EasyForm is smart enough to set the type of the input to password. It does a regex on the property name. So if you have like password confirmation, it'll still give you a password type. If you have an email field, or URL, color, tell, or search, I put tell to be a beginning of the string because tell is short enough where it could be anything. You may not necessarily want to have something else with tell in it to be a telephone field. Finally, it will also derive the input type off of the property value. So if you have a property value that is of type date, it will check the property value and it will give you a date type. These types that will derive from are strings, numbers, dates, booleans, which will give you a checkbox input type. If you don't like the order in which the content of the input div is coming out, you can do an input block, and then inside the input block, you can call the individual helpers to reorder the internals of it. So whereas previously we had label first and then the input, now we're doing input first and then label. And these are all used internally by EasyForms, so you can use them as well. Input, label, error, and hit field helpers. So let's see a demo. All right, so I will show code for this first. I actually want to kill, no, that's fine. Okay, so anyway, over here we have the form that I created. I did a name, age, password confirmation. Let me get rid of the CSS. On the middle, I have the validations that I've done. I've done a name, an age, and password. And so what you'll notice is that the submit button is actually disabled. The submit button will become re-enabled if we've used the submit helper here once the object itself is valid. So let's go back to this. It'll be easier to see. When I tab off the form, it will actually add a field with errors class to the wrapping div for the input. So I did I just made it bold and red for that. And as soon as I start typing now, actually I'll do Brian. So it's going to give me the next error immediately. And as soon as I satisfy it, it disappears. So if I leave and come back and I start typing again, it doesn't show up until I actually tab out, which is the according to the research that Luke W. did, the best conversion rates. So if we satisfy each of these, now we see the submit button is re-enabled, and I just have it wants to save my password to one password. So I just have an alert for the submit. We can see that over here. Internally, the submit that gets captured will do a send action, and so you can capture that action on the controller or the route, and it will do a action of named submit. Does anybody want me to play around with this at all, or anything they want me to try? Too bad. I'm moving on. All right. How do I get back to full screen? Whoa. What is going on? Oh yeah, I'll just stand back here. This is not entirely true. Field 4 is not completely implemented yet. Just recently, there was the with helper that I got added. Field 4 is a helper inside SimpleForm on Rails that will allow you to actually say, here's a related object, and we want to inject fields into this semantic form as a whole. But you can have either a single related object or a collection of related objects. And if you're supposed to be, or at least if I think you're supposed to be mixing your validations into the controller on in Ember templates, you can easily do that with a collection of objects. You can just do each and then set the item controller. And then off of that item controller, I can now set my, my validation rules. But the with was the equivalent of doing that for a single object. The problem, though, was that with did not previously accept an item controller. I added that in. It got in there for maybe 1.4, I think. But then there was a bug with it, so I wanted to hold off on implementing Fields 4 properly. So once this is, the bug is now resolved, so the next release of Ember will have it, and then I can add Fields 4, so you can now add in your related fields on other related objects. Same updating that Ember Validations needs to do or have. So ES6ifying and broccoliifying. Not sure what that one means. Sorry. All right, so you guys aren't San Francisco Ember. Damn it. All right, so I gave this talk 2 days ago at San Francisco Ember. Thank you, Ember Austin. And anyway, we are hiring. We are also for hire. We're doing full stack stuff. And we're also running a Ember conference. This is the scary Tomster, as some people like to say. Although we're not supposed to say it is a Tomster, even though it looks like it, because Tilda owns that brand. So, So we created I don't know, we'll call it Glaxter or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, so Wicked Ember Conference is a conference we're running in Boston, June 17th. We have, if you weren't able to come to EmberConf in San Francisco, then we welcome you to come to Wicked Ember. We've got around 100 people that are coming so far, 8 awesome speakers, and it should be a pretty good time. Tickets are not too expensive, about $190. That's it for Ember Easy Form and Ember Validations. Should I keep talking or should we move on? I think I'll take a break because my voice is dead. Yes.
So you mentioned that you don't like Bower.
I hate it. I'll kill it with fire. Do you work on Bower by any chance? I always say that, and then I'm like always worried that perhaps like the guy that made Bower's in the audience.
So what do you internally, do you vendor those two libraries, or do you use NPM?
No, we're using Bower. So because we use I hate it. But so we use Ember CLI for building out our Ember project right now, and it uses Bower. But little birdie told me that Ember CLI is moving off of Bower soon, which would be awesome. It's going to dump it, and Ember CLI will use NPM for its server-side concerns, and then it'll use Bower for its client-side concerns. I guess they're going to move over to using NPM for both sides. So they expect you to be hosting. Probably Stefan told me that. I don't know. If you hang out on the Ember CLI IRC channel, it was discussed in there a few times. I don't know when that's going to happen. They've just been talking about it. I think also that there's some problem with Bower and Broccoli. Jolis could not convince the Bower guys that something needed to be changed, and so this became a non-resolvable blocking issue. I don't remember what it is. Anything else? No? Okay, guys, thank you very much.
Okay. And so this is actually recording live. That's just too cool. Yeah. So,
So for the couple people that are watching, it's about to come back live.
oh, and I guess I need to put up on the.
Sandwiches were a good call.
Yeah, honestly, we could have probably used more, but
There's an whole other sandwiches. Oh, those are the sandwiches. There were two things. That was it. I thought I. Okay.
They're right next to each other.
Yeah.
There's still some left. Oh, good. Yeah, I think that was, so we ordered the right amount of sandwiches and chips.
What's that?
Didn't get it from here. Is there more in the fridge?
There's a whole other 12-pack of Shiner.
Oh,
So you're all good.
we managed to.
isn't that 12-pack been there forever?
It was from last month. Although one of them was a 6-pack. That's the thing. One of the 6-packs was last month. One of them was this month. I don't know how long. No, that's not the Shiner that was we cleaned the fridge out. Those are from last month's meetup. Oh wait, no, that's old. Charles. Yeah.
Which he was a telecom.
Oh, you mean like, are you talking before Charles? Oh, that's like,
It might be difficult to figure
There's definitely some issues that
so hard.
it's like cheaper early stage.
Right.
It's all the things.
Yeah, I read it. Everyone developed right now.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
But at least one of us was
From like 9 a.m. to 5 Yeah, it's surprising how it's just it's amazing. Yeah. You're talking never got back to me, but I guess he'll do when he dies without getting yeah, I mean, it's still very exploratory. Yeah, this is like that. I see what you're saying. I don't know. I think now that you can tell and that's great. Years ago, when it first so here's this is something the question that I'm wondering now how. So obviously, I mean, I think that I advise not ditching, like going going with the you start right. Refactoring versus like throw away and ditching it. If you still think that was there, I should have rewritten it. Knowing what I know now, I mean, I thought it was going on. I saw this. You have one deadline to have a working product. Where I was told to just, bring it back to channel. But there's nobody about and they hadn't really decided something.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started again.
Oh, yeah. No. I'd say it was just.
Can I give Steve like 2 or 3 minutes as founder dating?
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely. Oh, do you need a computer?
No, I'm just going to stand here and talk. But it's easier to stand behind something than to stand up there.
It gives you like
Exactly.
Hi everybody. So really fast, before Charles, I promise you this will have been worth your time. Before we have Charles take the thing. So there's this really cool thing. I don't know if you guys know Damon Cleanscales, but he's like my hero and coolest guy ever. And he's been working with a thing called founder dating for a long time. Pretty much everybody in this room should immediately quit your job and go start a startup. But if you don't believe me, I'd like to take a minute and listen to Steve, who does some cool volunteer stuff. So,
okay.
And then Charles is going to blow your mind. So.
Okay. So before Charles blows your mind, I'm going to talk to you about blowing your bank account. We're going to talk about equity for a minute. There's this disturbing trend that's been going on for the last 100 years. That technical guys who, 100-year trend, who basically build all the engines behind all these, basically industry's been completely transformed in this country over the last 15 or 20 years. And the technical guys who built it, the vast majority of the time, get only a very small slice of the equity and all that. If you are an employee joining an established company and they're really super excited about you as a software developer, you might get a fraction of a percent, maybe 1% of equity. But if you're a technical founder of a company, you can get like 50%. And while it's not super common, 20% is very common. 20x, right? So it's basically the only way to really break out of the cycle of the man taking most of the spoils is to be a founder. You look at what Larry Page and Sergey Brin did. They basically own over half of Google, and it's a couple of tech guys. It's the way to go. But there is one thing about what they did that's pretty unusual. They started a very successful company with 2 tech founders and nobody with a business background. Statistically, a business is drastically more likely to succeed if there is 1 tech founder and 1 business founder. And that's why this organization called Founder Dating was started, to help tech founders and business founders get together and start companies. So think about your long-term future. Think about starting something, and the best way to get going there is to find somebody who's got the complementary skill set of knowing how to do the product marketing, knowing how to do sales, and frankly knowing how to raise money with VCs. So I would highly recommend to everybody that you check into Founder Dating. And I'm the Austin area managing director for Founder Dating. And basically what I do is I go around and try to convince people, hey, you should join Founder Dating. And I also put on events. We have these quarterly kickoff events where the new members get together, and they're actually these really fun event. And then there's an online, it's almost like a dating site, where you put in everything that you're interested in. Well, that's the name, Founder Dating, right? You put in the areas that you're interested in working, and your particular skill sets, and all the people in the network search for, their counterpart, whether a business person is searching for their technical counterpart or vice versa. And there are about 200 members right now already in the Austin area. And if all of you guys join, then we'll be about up to 250. So we're looking forward to it. So to join, all you have to do is go to the Founder Dating website. It's really hard to remember. It's founderdating.com. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's a join button. So I highly recommend checking it out. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, Charles, go ahead.
All right. I'm not going to walk around in the area here. I'm just going to sit and glower at everybody. So we're all here because we either use Ember in our day jobs or we're curious about it. One of the reasons that I like it so much is that I feel it has this beautiful way of mapping a hierarchical URL to a hierarchy of routes to a hierarchy of views and keeping all of those in sync. And really, I feel like it provides this great container for my application. It lets me focus on what's inside that container that I can present to the user, what makes it unique. And so what I'm hoping to share with you tonight is the way of thinking that I have about how you should structure what sits inside that container, how you should structure your models, how you should reason about your models. So I'm hoping to share with you the power of M. My name is Charles Lowell. I work here right at the front side. There's my Twitter handle. And when I talk about the power of M, I'm of course talking about the model in MVC. And everybody has heard of MVC, right? It's what every good UI is built with MVC. But it can be hard to actually pin down what MVC really is. It's kind of a cagey term. And if you go out on the internet, you're going to see all kinds of different people trying to explain MVC in different ways, and you're not going to get two people to agree on what it is. And I don't really want to argue about what MVC is, because there are many different conceptions on it. Ember has its own take on MVC. Jeffrey actually did a great talk here at EmberATX where he kind of explained that take and how it related to other environments that you might be familiar with. But my goal here tonight is to kind of talk about MVC and the roles that each piece plays, but really to focus on the model, because I feel like the model is what's preeminent, and while the view and the controller do have a place to play, if you get the model right, then everything just kind of shakes out nicely. And Ember has a fantastic primitives for working with models. Primitives that Brian was talking about tonight, EmberObject, is such a fantastic foundation. And even though these concepts are universal, Ember really gives you a leg up in working with them. So I want to introduce you to one of my favorite UI developers. This is actually, he lived about 4,000 years ago. His name's Plato, and you can actually see his Chromebook there. Not many people know that he was into JavaScript. But he actually came up with a pretty famous analogy that I find very useful in terms of thinking about models. And that's this idea of a cave. And the idea is that being in this physical world is like being inside of a cave. And up back at the entrance of the cave, near the entrance of the cave, there's this fire burning. And shapes move in front of that fire. But we here in the physical world can only see the shadows that those shapes cast on the wall. We can't actually see the real shapes that are moving in front of the fire. All we can perceive is those shadows, but we know that the shapes of those shadows and the way those shadows interact with each other are as they are only as a function of the shape of the form that cast them and the interaction of that form with the light. And I think that's something that I always go back to, is to really try and get at what is the model, what is the shape. Plato called them his theory of forms, the true shape of something. So to kind of demonstrate this principle in action, I wanted to kind of move from the abstract into the realm of something that, at least for most of us, is very accessible, something that we're very familiar with, and that's the concept of a color. Most of us know what that is, and so we're gonna be modeling a color and modeling relationships between colors. It's going to be actually surprisingly complex. There's lots of different ways to encode a color, and this is just a few demonstrations, but the idea is that this is going to be our primitive value. It's just going to be like a string or an integer or something like that that we can use as the value for these properties on these Ember objects. So the first example that we're going to cover here is we're just going to set a color directly on a color swatch component. And the idea here is that when a color appears at that little point, then the swatch will react. If the color changes, then the swatch changes. There's a direct implication. There's a direct shadow that's being cast on that swatch, so to speak. And so here we have it. I just have a little toggle here. Here's the swatch. And I just have a little toggle that directly sets a single color on it. So if we click it, then I've got some code that's just saying set it to green. Set it to green. Click on and click off. And that's pretty simple. Oops. And we can do this, we can replicate this with 2 color swatches, where we have the same color being used as the input for both swatches. But again, because they behave exactly the same, because the computation is the same, when a color is set, it's going to be reflected in both places. So here we have that case. And I can click the color on, click the color off, and when I was developing this, I just would sit there and do this for hours. It's great. Very relaxing, very zen. Yeah, that too. And this is in essence data binding. We come to data binding usually through the form of strings and in templates, but the beauty of Ember is that data binding is a first-class citizen in the Ember world. You can take any 2 objects and you can just click them together. You can just bind them right together. So here we have those swatches. They're bound. So binding is a separate concern from templates, where most of us come to it from. And it's important to note that binding is not just observation. It's actually something that sits on top of observation, and it lets you click together any 2 properties that share the same data type. So if I've got two objects that have a string value, I can put them together, and then essentially they are the same property. It's important to think of it not like there's a binding between them, but almost they overlap in space. They're the same, kind of like conjoined twins or people in a 3-legged sack race, or something like that. So it's implemented with observers. So you can see if a value appears at A, it will immediately be propagated over to B. And if a value appears at B, it will immediately be propagated over to A. And I've shown you this so you can forget about it. This is a 2-way binding. You can also have 1-way bindings, but my point is, when you're thinking about these things, not to think about the mechanism by which it happens. When sound is traveling through the air, you don't think about the molecules knocking into each other. You think about the sound wave and the meaning that the sound carries. And that's kind of the way you want to think about bindings is, yes, there are observers doing the bookkeeping and stuff like that, but they're just the red blood cells carrying the values around your application. And it's important because then you're able to encapsulate the computation of your objects in between these different binding points. So we're going to see a little bit more complex example of this in action, and I've got a model here called a desaturator, and it has one property, which is a color, an input. It's got another property, which is the output, which is also a color, and then a value between 0 and 1, which represents how much the color on the left will be desaturated. So this color on the right is a pure function of the color on the left and this desaturation value. And so we can see this in action if we plug it into our 2 swatches. We're going to put this desaturator in between the 2 swatches and see what happens. And so here we have it. I've got, here's the color on the left and the color on the right, and if I slide down to the right, you can see the color becomes desaturificate. I don't know. The point is like I can explain what desaturation is to you until I'm blue in the face, but it probably made a lot more sense when I did this. And I can just see, oh, well, desaturation is literally just sucking the color right out. It's like how pure is that color? And of course, if I have a partially desaturated value and I click off the color, then the desaturated black is just black. And so you can see the relationship of these things. So that works really, really well if we're binding a color to a color. But in real applications, we often have to take input from users. So we have heterogeneous data types. So we have, for like, if we wanted to do a text input for a color, the user is going to be typing in, keystrokes to produce a string. But then what we really want as input to our system, whether it's a desaturator or a swatch or whatever, is we want a color. So we need to convert this string into a color. But because they have different data types, we can't just click them together. The surfaces don't mesh. But luckily, the answer is another model. And so here, I've theorized this model, but there's actually an implementation. But when presented this problem, you can say, well, let's propose a model that has one property that's a string and the other property that's a color. And so if a string appears here that implies a color, that color value will be represented up here. And if a color appears here that represents, a color appears here, then the corresponding string will appear down here. And that is essentially a color syntax. It's a way of encoding colors. And we've probably seen that several times. There's lots of different ways to encode a color. And so what I've done is I've taken this color syntax object and I've bound it to two text fields. So we've got strings. But here's the interesting part is I've actually taken that color syntax and then bound them both to one color. So we have two color syntaxes connected to two text fields, but they're both bound to the same color. Because if you've got the same data type, you can bind almost anything together. And so we'll see that in action here. So here we have those text fields bound to this color. And you can see that if I want to desaturate this color right here, these two text fields are bound to the one on the left. So if I change that to yellow, it affects the text field, and it affects, now I have a desaturated yellow instead of a desaturated green. And you'll notice that this text field is also updating, even though it's at a different, it's using a different encoding format. They're both bound to the same color. So I can change this right here back to green, or I can make it blue, and the corresponding RGB value updates here. Another interesting thing to note is that there's nothing special. I didn't say that this was RGB, or I didn't say that this was going to be a hex format. I can put that down here, and they'll still stay in sync if I'm using RGB in both. And I can use, white. I can use the hex encoding for both. It doesn't really matter. The next logical question is, how is this color composed? We're able to see here how the color, we're able to see how this color relates here, but we can actually use models to decompose values so that we can gain knowledge about them. And so here I've made a RGB selector model, and what that does is, once again, you'll see a pattern emerging here. We have a color on this side, and that implies a value, an integer value for R, an integer value for G, an integer value for B, all between 0 and 255. By the same token, that triple of RGB values also implies a color over here. And so there's a very clear relationship between the two. And so if one changes, this is going to change, and if this changes, then this can change right here. And so using that technique, I killed Chrome. Wow. Okay. This might take a little bit to load these examples. Hold on a second. Yeah, it was just too much. Let's see. Let's see what we need to do here. Okay. Please bear with. No, I think it might be. There might be some. Yeah. So I got that going for me, which is nice. Let's see. No, it's spinning. It's probably loading something. It's waiting on some asset to load over the internet that doesn't want to load. Let's see. There we go. Okay, we'll look for crashes in the future. And so we can actually plug this into our assembly just by binding it to the color. It's actually, that part is really easy. If you've got this model that can decompose an RGB value, you can just click it right in. And so here we have, this is exactly what we have. And so I've removed the other swatch, but you can see how mixing the different RGB values has an overall effect on the color. Because while the text input was nice, we can't really get in there and manipulate it. We have to enter in a value, see what happens. Enter in a value, see what happens. But here we can touch these directly and get behind it. Which is cool, which is nice. I like that. But this still doesn't actually tell us how the computer is rendering the RGB value. We can actually make a RGB visualizer component, which just takes a color and paints a visualization. There's no real relation on the model. We just have a canvas component, and when a color appears here, we just paint it on the canvas. And so I made a visualization component, which just takes the different components of the RGB color and paints them on top of each other. And one of the things that this demonstrates is that RGB is actually a additive color system. So you can see if I have a pure green here, and then I fade in a pure red, you can see that you get red plus green is yellow, and then this value in the middle is the rendered color. So if I've got all the colors up, then I can see, well, green and blue is cyan, red and blue is magenta, and then I've got the white right there in the middle. And so you can, again, play with how the colors mix together. And RGB is really, really interesting, but it's unfortunate that this is the one that we are introduced to first, because RGB is really, really a fantastic encoding format if you happen to be a pixel. If you happen to be a little piece of hardware that's designed to emit light, RGB is great. It's like, give me a red value, give me a green value, give me a blue value, add them together and shoot them out into people's eyes. But that doesn't, when it comes to working with color, that's not a language that we understand. Interestingly enough, someone actually pointed this out to me. That is the language that your retina understands. Your cones actually do perceive RGB values. But psychologically and conceptually, that's not how we think about color. It's this crazy on-the-fly mixing of three component colors. And so there are systems, coordinate systems, for thinking about color that are couched in terms of human perception. And probably the most common one that you're likely to encounter is HSL, color coordinates. How many people have heard of HSL? Okay, and how many people learned RGB first before HSL? Yeah, it's really weird that that's. It's kind of like, I guess it's like RGB is like the assembly language, but when you actually want to work with color at a high level, you want to use a more perceptual coordinate system. And so HSL is comprised of three components: the hue, which I'll read the definition of this, which is the degree to which a stimulus can be described as similar to or different from stimuli that are described as red, green, blue, yellow. Saturation, colorfulness of a color relative to its own brightness. The subjective brightness perception of a color for humans along a lightness-darkness axis. Seems really, that's obvious to me. How'd you guys do with that? You know, it's using perceptual terms like how humans think, but that doesn't mean anything to me. And so I know personally I struggled a lot with HSL and what it is that you could do with it. But luckily we've already got a system set up and we've decomposed our RGB coordinates, so we can do exactly the same for our HSL coordinates. All we need is a model that relates these two values. And so we'll just take that HSL selector, just like we took our RGB selector, and we'll just plug it right in and bind it to that same color value. And so here we have, you can see the HSL values on the left there and the RGB values on the right. And so we'll take, first we'll take a look at hue, which is right here, and you can see as I adjust the hue, you know, I can start from over here, and I've got a pure red, and then as I move my hue up, the green fades in. Come on, green, go green, and then once we have this pure yellow, which is the mixture of red and green, then the red fades out until we're left with pure green, and then the blue fades in, so we have this pure cyan, and then the green fades out till we're left with a pure blue, and the red fades back in till we have a pure magenta, and blue fades out until we have, again, pure red. And you can see that as I go from here to here, we're kind of moving around from, you know, red to blue to green to red, red to green to blue to red, like that. The saturation, and so that to me is a much more much better explanation of what hue is. Like, I feel like I can grasp hue much better. It really is the color coordinate, the purity, that pure color, and then the saturation, which we've already actually seen in this demo, which is the intensity of the color. So at a saturation of 1 up here, you know, we have this pure hue. In this case, it's pure purple. But as we move the saturation down, that hue gets much less pure, less pure, less pure, less pure, until we're left with a gray. And you can see where they all meet in there, the gray. So we're changing one coordinate. You can see the RGB values are going crazy. Actually, they're not. If you look at what's going on over on the visualization, it seems like it's going crazy, but what's actually happening is you can see that the values are normalizing. Red and blue are sliding down, and green is sliding up in a linear fashion until they meet all in one line, and you've got a gray there. And then finally, you've got the lightness, which is basically a fade to white and a fade to black. So you can see as I increase the lightness up to 1, I fade out to white. Lightness of 0.5 has essentially no mix, and then a lightness of 0 is black. It's dark, fading down. So there's hue, saturation, and lightness for you. Yeah, it's interesting to notice that if you've got a lightness of 1, then it doesn't matter what your hue is up here. You change the hue, your RGB values are still pegged. Your white doesn't matter. So you can also visualize the HSL space. And So we can do the, what's that? Yeah. You always, as I was building this thing, it was like, wow, this is quite an assembly that's going on. But we can do the exact same thing that we did before. We take an HSL visualizer, which just copies a color over into a pixel space. And so here you can see we have the HSL visualization here, but you can see that, remember how we went around with those RGB values? You can actually see that hue is a radial coordinate. It goes around. It starts at red and it ends at red, and it goes around like this. And you've actually probably seen this color wheel many, many times when you're using a color chooser. But you know, it never really occurred to me that this is why. Is because you have you're treating the hue as this radial coordinate. And then your saturation, you can see you've got your pure hues are right out at the edge. And then as I decrease my saturation, well then, you know, the colors are grayer towards the middle of this thing. And so as I'm decreasing the saturation, I'm removing the color, and you know, I get my radius gets a little bit slimmer. And so you can see we've got you know, the hue is the angle, and then the saturation is just where you are along the radius. And then when it comes to lightness, you can see that the space is actually a bicone here, and you've got pure white right at the peak, and then you've got pure black right at the bottom. And so as I move my lightness up right there, I go down to black. So you hear a lot about HSL space and RGB space, and so you can really see how all these values relate to each other, and how these coordinates are formed. And so thus far, we've been dealing with all these values existing inside of a single web application. But you can really get a value from anywhere. And so I actually wrote a server component, which is actually conceptually very simple. It's just a black box. It's a black box that's got a single property, which is a color. Now, behind the scenes, it can do whatever it wants, but when it's talking with the rest of our model, if a color appears here, it can propagate that color to the server. If a color appears on the server, it can propagate here and then flow through the rest of our model. And so we can actually plug this thing in to make color book, which is, if you're a color, you're going to want to hang out with your friends. And so this is color book is color book. Yeah, that's a little bit of a Frankenstein there. I was running out of room, so I kind of. But the principle is sound. The concept is the same. We've got this server. We're just going to bind it to the color value. And so I've actually got a demo here. So we'll. So I am going to start my server here. So I have a little Rails server that's just going to, using WebSockets, that's going to coordinate between two different assemblies. And then if I go to here and here and connect here, then I can, I can update my color values there, and you can see that it's moving. These are two different web pages, but the values are communicating through the server. So if I bring up my saturation there, you can see, hey, you can see that the hue is changing. So, anyhow.
I just realized that's in the way.
Yeah.
It's a lamp roll. What's WebSocket?
What's that?
Yeah. The Lantern WebSockets these days.
Yeah. So.
You're not impressed.
All right. So what I hope I've shown is that using these modeling techniques is really actually quite simple. It's really like clicking together Tinker Toys. And Ember has fantastic, fantastic primitives for helping you do this. Probably the most complex component in this whole system was the HSL selector, but it's not. I mean, you can see that it's not that complex in of itself. It's just 4 different inputs and determining what it means to the value on the right for these values on the left, and vice versa. You know, I've shied away from defining like what a model is, but I think it's fair to say that all it is just a group of values that with which you understand how they relate to each other. And if you can grasp that understanding, that's the difficult part. That's the hard part of building your application. Once you've actually sat down with the pen and the paper and you've worked through all of this, then putting it together is actually, you know, can be a very simple and gratifying process. You know, I always go back to the analogy of the cave, where you have your model that sits there. That's the true shape of it, and once you do, you can use it to cast shadows anywhere that you want. So, in his conception of this cave, one of the things that Plato, one of his goals, was to explain to people, to the layman, what it was that philosophers do. Why is it important for them to study, you know, to study the physical world and try and discover these true forms? And I really do think that is our job in the work that we do, and I think that it can be really fun and really gratifying, and I hope you guys have fun with it. So thank you. The talk here is on yeah.
Oh, wait.
And so I guess we can take questions.
Any questions? How does LiPo WebSockets? I don't know.
So
I like it pregnant.
So there's a little. This is a what is it? This thing? It's a Philips Hue. It's a fantastic. It's these little bulbs that actually have a wireless transmitter in them, and so they plug into normal lamps, but you can actually connect to them over your network and change the color and the brightness. And
using the power of $200.
In the last 7 years.
Hey, guess what? Ember community is great. You guys are awesome. Thanks everybody for coming out. Everybody's welcome to hang out for a little while. I don't know if people are going to clump together for post game or go home. I don't know if this is Salt Lake City or what. So anyway, everybody's welcome to do whatever they want. It's a free country. So, but thank you everybody for coming. If you tell your friends, we're going to run out of space, so let's keep this between us.
Go to the England metaverse.
Yeah. I don't think they have a meetup, but they do.
They actually do.
They do? Okay. It's probably
All
pretty
three
good.
of them. Well, there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
All the Java devs.
What's that?
Hey-o. All right. Thanks everybody.
Draft House in walking distance?
Draft House is walking distance.
Yeah, it's the best bar. We should go there.
We should, yeah.
Draft
so-
House is it.
And Anybody? Yeah. Anybody that wants to meet at the draft house after is welcome to. There'll be a little cleanup for a few select 4 blocks.
It's like 42nd.
42nd. Yeah, straight up,
Yeah.
4 blocks.
East side changes out there too. Oh yeah, it's nice. I saw that.
Take the left fork at the Shell station. Support him.
Last time we did that.
Last time we did that, I was in Austin.
What are you doing?
Yes. Yeah, it's all. It's actually. I should put the project. It's if you go to Cowboys, get out /Cowboys.
That's yours.
Oh, I know.
And same thing, just
Remember that drama party in the bar?
Yeah.
Oh,
What's that? Thanks. All right.
That was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was the slickest demo ever.
Really? Yeah, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah.
It was fun. It was fun to develop.
I bet. How much opportunity guys was that?
How many billable hours was that?
Yeah, exactly. It was a lot.
Yeah.
And you know what? We're talking about we had because we had kind of a slow and March, April time frame. It was like, well,
Might as well.
it's a really good conference talks.
Yeah.
See that helps.
Yeah.
That was great.
I think that actually went a little bit better than just
I did too. I think
So one thing I was confused about, did you have actually separate models for each one of those little things, like the HSL select model, or was that like
What?
Ember?
It was an Ember component. Basically, I could have, well, so it's an Ember component to contain that model. So I mean, this is the way that I conceived of it, and then I ended up implementing how this component. So like the HSL selector was, but like the HSL selector, it wasn't like the component, like the model was there.
I just shut my laptop in the middle of the broadcast.
I had some sliders in the template that bound the RGB values, and then I kind of
We're supposed to make an announcement about this?
the color to the component
this
in the template. So I mean,
This guy.
I could have separated it out into a separate model and then had the component use that, but